Everyone thought this wedding was about love. It wasn't. It was about control, money, and one mistake nobody saw coming. By sunset, a demand would be made. By nightfall, lives would quietly collapse. And the woman everyone dismissed would become the only one prepared. Grace stood barefoot in the sand, a champagne glass in her hand, watching her daughter get married to a man who had never once looked at her with respect. Rebecca looked perfect. Calm smile, straight posture. Eyes already trained on a future Grace was not meant to be part of. David Harrington leaned close to Rebecca as the applause faded. His smile was sharp, practiced, the kind that never reached his eyes. Grace didn't cry, she didn't smile either. She had learned long ago that emotions were expensive. The reception moved quickly. Laughter, music, expensive food Grace didn't touch. She sat where she was told. Far from the front, far from the family table, far from relevance. That was when David came over. "Grace," he said lightly, as if they were old friends. "Beautiful event, isn't it?" "It is," she replied. Rebecca joined them immediately, too quickly, like this moment had been planned. David lowered his voice. "We need to clear something up." Grace waited. "The wedding ran over budget," he continued. "A lot over." Rebecca crossed her arms. "We assumed you'd help." "With what?" Grace asked. David didn't hesitate. 50,000. The number landed cleanly. No hesitation, no apology. Grace blinked once. "I don't have that kind of money." Rebecca's smile tightened. "Then we need to be honest about expectations." David took over. "Our lives are changing, Grace, our circle, our standards." Rebecca finally said it. "If you can't contribute, it's better we create distance." Grace looked at her daughter, really looked at her. "And if I don't?" Grace asked. Rebecca answered without emotion. "Then this is where it ends. No holidays, no calls, no role in our lives." David added calmly, "Think of it as paying for access, or choosing solitude." Around them guests laughed, glasses clinked, a band played something cheerful. Grace lifted her champagne and took a slow sip. She smiled. "You forgot one thing," she said quietly. David frowned. Rebecca's breath caught. Grace set the glass down. "Excuse me," she added, "I need a moment." She walked away before either of them could speak. Neither noticed her hands were steady. Neither realized the demand they made was not the beginning of their power. It was the trigger. Grace did not go to the restroom. She walked past it, down the side path near the dunes, where the noise of the wedding softened and no one followed. She stopped only when she was sure she was alone. Then she sat, placed her purse on her lap, and exhaled once. The demand replayed clearly in her mind: 50,000 or disappear. They believed she was cornered. That belief came from years of seeing only what they wanted to see. To them, Grace was a woman who arrived alone, a woman who wore a modest dress, a woman who had never once raised her voice or demanded anything, someone who had always stepped back when told. They mistook restraint for weakness. Grace took out her phone, no shaking, no hesitation. She opened a contact saved under a single name, Sarah. She typed 5 words. "It's time, proceed as planned." The reply came almost instantly. "Understood." Grace locked the phone and slipped it back into her purse. She stayed seated, listening to the waves, not for peace, for patience. This was not revenge. Revenge was loud, emotional, reckless. This was correction. Inside the reception area, David was already restless. "Where did she go?" he asked Rebecca. "She'll come back," Rebecca said, though something in her tone had shifted. "She always does." David scanned the crowd. She didn't argue. Rebecca frowned. "She never does." "That's not reassuring," he said. Rebecca dismissed it. "She's proud, she'll find a way to pay." David didn't answer. He remembered the way Grace had smiled, not pleading, not embarrassed. Certain. At the bar, David's father was speaking with 2 men Grace had never met, investors, quiet ones, men who didn't drink much and watched everything. Across the room, a wedding coordinator checked her tablet, confused by a sudden update she didn't remember approving. Phones began vibrating. One, then another. Rebecca noticed first. She glanced at her screen and frowned. That's strange. What? David asked. My business account, she said. I just got a notification. She opened the email, her face drained slightly. What is it? David asked again, sharper. It says, pending review. David stiffened. Review of what? Before she could answer, another phone buzzed, then another. Around them, guests began checking screens. Conversations paused, a low murmur spread. David's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID and froze. His father. Rebecca whispered, David. He didn't answer her, he answered the call. What did you do? His father demanded, voice loud enough to hear through the phone. David turned away. What are you talking about? We just received legal documents, his father said, about your wife's business. Rebecca's chest tightened. My business. David's father continued, ownership, control, irregular transfers. Do you want to explain why my name is now connected to an investigation? David slowly turned back toward Rebecca. At that moment, Grace stood and began walking back toward the reception. Not hurried, not smiling. Just in time, Grace did not rush back. She entered the reception through the side, unseen by Rebecca at first. She observed. Confusion had started spreading, quiet but fast. People were checking phones, some were stepping away to take calls. David's confidence was cracking in small, controlled movements. Grace stopped near the edge of the crowd. This moment had been prepared long before today. Years earlier, Grace had learned a rule that never failed her. Power belongs to the person who moves first and explains last. Rebecca finally saw her. Mom, she said quickly, walking toward her. Something strange is happening. Grace looked at her daughter's face. Panic was new on it. Grace said nothing. David joined them, phone still in his hand. His voice was lower now, controlled, forced. What did you do? He asked. Grace met his eyes. I protected myself. Rebecca frowned. From what? Grace answered calmly. From being erased. David stepped closer. This isn't the time for drama. Grace nodded. That's why I didn't create any. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. She opened the email fully this time. Her breathing changed. Mom, she said slowly, why does this say majority ownership? Grace corrected her. Because that's what it is. Rebecca shook her head. No, that's not possible. This is my company. Grace didn't argue. You run it, you don't own it. David cut in sharply. You're lying. Grace turned to him. You never asked. Rebecca's voice cracked. What is happening? Grace finally spoke clearly, not loud, not soft. 18 years ago, I learned that love without protection turns into leverage. When I helped you start the business, I protected both of us. Legally. Rebecca's eyes widened. You said you were just helping. I was, Grace replied, and I was also careful. David laughed once, short and tense. This won't hold, my lawyers. Already know, Grace interrupted. David stopped. Grace continued. The transfers from the business account to your side projects triggered automatic flags. The investors you brought in without approval were notified. The audit started before the ceremony ended. Rebecca stared at her. You planned this. Grace answered honestly. I planned for this. Rebecca's hands shook. Why would you do this to me? Grace looked at her daughter for a long moment. Because you gave me terms, she said. 50,000 or disappear. You made it clear what my place was. David's phone rang again. He answered it immediately. Yes, I understand. No, she didn't sign anything today. He lowered the phone slowly. This wedding, he said quietly, is becoming a problem. Grace nodded. It was always a transaction to you. Rebecca stepped forward. Mom, please fix this. Grace didn't move. There are consequences, Grace said, and tonight they start. Around them, conversations stopped. The music faded. A few guests were already leaving. Staff moved nervously. David looked at Grace with something close to fear. You're not who I thought you were, he said. Grace replied simply, that's because you never needed me to be. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an email. It was a notification that changed everything. Her face went white. Rebecca stared at her phone as if it had betrayed her. David, she said quietly, the account is frozen. He took the phone from her hand, read once, then again. "This is temporary," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "These things can be reversed." Grace watched him closely. She had seen men like this before, men who believed influence was permanent. Rebecca turned to her. "You did this." Grace nodded. "Yes." "You could undo it," Rebecca said quickly. "You still can." Grace didn't answer. David stepped in front of Rebecca, lowering his voice. "Let's talk privately." Grace responded instead. "Everything that needs to be said can be said here." David clenched his jaw. "You're humiliating us." Grace replied evenly. "You tried to remove me from your life in public. I returned the courtesy." Rebecca's breathing became uneven. "Mom, please, this is my future." Grace looked at her daughter. "So was mine." David's phone rang again. He didn't wait to see who it was. "Yes," he said, "I'm at the wedding." Pause. "No, she didn't warn us." Another pause. His posture changed. "I understand," he said finally. "We'll talk later." He ended the call and looked at Grace differently now. Calculating, defensive. "My family is distancing themselves," he said. "Do you realize what you're doing?" Grace answered calmly. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Rebecca whispered, "This wasn't supposed to happen." Grace turned to her. "Neither was the ultimatum." Rebecca swallowed. "You could have talked to me." "I tried," Grace said. "You were busy planning how to manage me." Rebecca stiffened. "You saw that." Grace nodded, every word. David exhaled sharply. That document was hypothetical. Grace met his eyes. "So was your future." A man approached them, one of the investors. His expression was tense. "Rebecca," he said, "we need to talk, now." Rebecca looked at Grace again. "Just make it stop." Grace shook her head once. "That's not how this works." David stepped back, realizing something too late. "You waited," he said. "You let us think we had control." Grace answered quietly. "You demanded money from someone you thought was powerless." Another guest approached, then another. The wedding had stopped being a celebration. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message marked legal notice. Her hands dropped to her side. "Mom," she whispered, "what happens next?" Grace replied without hesitation. "Now," she said, "you learn who you pushed aside." Rebecca didn't answer the investors. She stood frozen, phone still in her hand. David moved first. "Give us a moment," he told them. One of the men replied coldly, "You've already had enough moments." He walked away. Silence settled between the three of them. Rebecca finally looked at Grace. "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace answered simply, "You didn't ask." "That's not fair," Rebecca said. Grace replied, "Neither was your offer." David stepped in again. "This is getting out of control." Grace met his gaze. "It already was, you just weren't aware." Rebecca's voice lowered. "You're enjoying this." Grace shook her head. "I'm enduring it." Rebecca's phone rang. She answered without checking the name. "Yes." Pause. "I don't understand." Pause. "No, that account funds everything." Her face tightened. She ended the call and looked at Grace. "Suppliers are canceling." Grace nodded. They were notified. David's jaw tightened. "You're destroying her business." Grace corrected him. "I'm stopping you from draining it." Rebecca whispered, "You don't trust me." Grace replied, "You plan to remove me after the wedding." Rebecca's eyes filled. That was David's idea. David snapped, "Don't do that." Grace watched the shift. Blame always surfaced when pressure arrived. Rebecca turned to David. "You said it was temporary." David looked away. Grace spoke calmly. "He told you what you needed to hear." Rebecca's voice shook. "Is this about money?" Grace said, "This is about choice." David stepped closer to Grace. "You're still her mother, you can still fix this." Grace answered, "I was her mother when you threatened to erase me." David lowered his voice. "Think carefully." Grace met his eyes. "I am." Another notification arrived on Rebecca's phone. She didn't open it. "What if I choose you now?" Rebecca asked suddenly. "What if I end this?" Grace paused. "End what?" she asked. Rebecca looked at David. David laughed once tense. "You can't be serious." Rebecca said, "You said this was business." David replied, "This is survival." Grace watched them both. "This," she said, "is why I stayed silent." Rebecca's phone buzzed again. She finally opened the message. Her face collapsed. David reached for the phone. "What is it?" Rebecca whispered, "They're calling for a full audit, personal accounts included." David's confidence vanished. Grace stepped back slightly. "This is only the beginning," she said. Rebecca looked at her, fear replacing anger. "How far does this go?" Grace answered clearly. "As far as the truth does." David stepped away first. Not to calm things down, to think. That was always his move when control slipped. Rebecca stayed, her eyes stayed on Grace. "You never wanted the business," Rebecca said. "You said it was mine." Grace replied, "I wanted you safe." "That's not the same thing," Rebecca said. Grace answered, "It is when money changes people." David returned, voice measured, "We can negotiate." Grace looked at him, "You already did." Rebecca's phone rang again. She didn't answer. She already knew what it would be. David spoke carefully. "You freeze accounts, investors panic, reputations break. That hurts everyone." Grace said, "You didn't care who you hurt when you made your demand." David's tone sharpened. "This isn't about you." Grace corrected him. "It became about me when you tried to buy my silence." Rebecca looked between them. "You planned this for months." Grace nodded. "After I saw the spreadsheet." Rebecca closed her eyes. "You were going to let me marry him." Grace said, "I was going to let you choose." David laughed under his breath. "This is emotional." Grace replied, "This is documented." A woman from the legal team approached briefly and handed Grace a phone. Grace didn't look at the screen. She already knew. "Proceed," Grace said quietly, handing it back. Rebecca's breath caught. "Proceed with what?" Grace met her eyes. "Transfer of authority." David stepped back. "You can't just take over." Grace said, "I already have." Rebecca whispered, "What does that mean?" Grace answered, "It means I decide what survives." David's phone buzzed. He looked at it once and turned pale. "They're pulling support," he said. "My family is stepping away." Grace said, "They don't like exposure." Rebecca looked at him sharply. "What did you do?" David snapped, "I was securing our future." Grace interrupted, "By using what wasn't yours." Rebecca stepped away from him. David reached out, "Rebecca." She pulled back. Grace watched silently. This was not satisfaction. This was inevitability. Rebecca turned back to Grace. "If I leave him, does this stop?" Grace paused, then answered honestly, "No." Rebecca swallowed, "So I lose everything." Grace said, "You lose what was built on deception." David's voice rose, "You're turning her against me." Grace replied, "You did that yourself." Rebecca's phone buzzed again. She didn't check it this time. She looked up. "You never wanted credit, you never asked for thanks." Grace nodded. "That's why you forgot I existed." David stared at Grace. "You waited until we thought we'd won." Grace said quietly, "You demanded proof of my worth." She looked at them both. "This," she said, "is my answer." Rebecca sat down without realizing she had done it. Her wedding dress spread around her, untouched by hands that no longer knew what to do. David remained standing. He always did when he felt cornered. "This isn't real," Rebecca said. "This can't be." Grace replied, "It's been real for a long time." David crossed his arms. "You don't understand the consequences." Grace answered, "I understand leverage." Rebecca looked up at her. "You never warned me." Grace said, "I warned you every time I stayed silent." David stepped forward. "Let's be practical." Grace looked at him. "That was your mistake." He lowered his voice. "You freeze everything, fine. Then what? You walk away, you leave her ruined." Grace replied, "I leave her informed." Rebecca's voice broke. "I didn't think you'd fight back." Grace met her eyes. "You didn't think I could." David smiled thinly. "You still need us." Grace shook her head. "You needed me, you just didn't respect it." Rebecca checked her phone again despite herself. Her expression changed. "They're asking questions," she said. "Questions I don't have answers to." Grace nodded. "Truth tends to do that." David's phone rang. He ignored it. Then it rang again. He answered sharply, "What?" Pause. "No, that account isn't personal." Longer pause. "I said it's not." He ended the call and looked at Grace with open anger now. "You're forcing their hand." Grace replied calmly, "You forced mine first." Rebecca stood slowly. "Is there anything I can say?" Grace studied her daughter's face, not the fear, the recognition beneath it. "Yes," Grace said, "you can tell me why you were ready to trade me." Rebecca opened her mouth, closed it. David spoke instead. "She wanted a life you couldn't give her." Grace turned to him. "I gave her everything she stands on." Rebecca whispered, "I was tired of being reminded where I came from." The words hung between them. Grace nodded once, "And now you remember." Rebecca's phone buzzed again. This time she didn't look. David laughed bitterly. "You think you've won." Grace answered, "This isn't a game." Rebecca looked up sharply. "Then what is it?" Grace replied, "A correction." Another guest approached cautiously. "There's an issue with the venue billing." David snapped, "Handle it." The guest hesitated. "They won't proceed without confirmation from the majority owner." All eyes turned to Grace. She said nothing. David stared at her. In that moment, he understood something too late. There had never been a deal. There had only been patience. David finally looked around. The wedding no longer belonged to him. Guests were whispering. Staff waited for instructions that never came. Phones kept buzzing. The room was fractured into quiet crises. David turned back to Grace. "End this." Grace replied, "It ends when the truth finishes moving." Rebecca stepped forward. "You said you never wanted control." Grace answered, "I never wanted to need it." David's voice hardened. "You're making enemies." Grace said, "I already had them." Rebecca's phone rang again. She answered this time. "Yes, I understand. No, I didn't authorize that." Pause. "I didn't know." She lowered the phone slowly. "They're asking about transfers I approved," she said, "on your advice." David snapped, "Don't say that here." Grace didn't intervene. She let the silence work. Rebecca looked at David. "You told me it was standard." David replied, "It is." Grace corrected him, "Not when ownership is hidden." Rebecca stepped back from him. "You said my mother was emotional." David didn't answer. Grace spoke evenly. "You built your plan assuming I would stay quiet." David laughed without humor, "Because you always did." Grace nodded, "Until you tried to erase me." Another man approached, older, confident. He looked at Grace. "Ms. Foster," he said, "legal counsel is requesting confirmation." Grace nodded, "Approved." He left. Rebecca's breath caught. "You're dismantling everything." Grace replied, "I'm separating what's real from what isn't." David clenched his fists. "You think this makes you powerful?" Grace met his stare. "No, it makes me finished." Rebecca whispered, "Finished with what?" Grace answered, "Being useful only when demanded." David stepped closer. "If you continue, there will be fallout." Grace replied, "I accounted for it." Rebecca looked at her mother, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You planned for me to turn against you," Rebecca said. Grace answered, "I planned for you to choose." Rebecca's eyes filled. "And if I choose wrong?" Grace said, "Then you live with it." David's phone rang again. He didn't answer. Rebecca's phone buzzed once more. She looked at the message and froze. "They've canceled the merger," she whispered. David closed his eyes. Grace said nothing. She didn't need to. The control David thought he had built was collapsing piece by piece, not loudly, not dramatically. Just cleanly. And everyone could feel it. Rebecca lowered her phone slowly. "Canceled," she repeated. They walked away. David exhaled through his nose. "Give me a moment." He turned as if leaving would restore order. It didn't. Grace watched him carefully. This was the point where men like David revealed their core, not in anger, in retreat. Rebecca spoke without looking at him. "You said they were committed." David replied, "They were, until this." Grace added, "Until they saw a risk." David stopped, "You don't get to lecture." Grace replied, "I don't need to." Rebecca faced him now. "Did you know this would happen?" David hesitated. That pause was enough. Rebecca's voice sharpened. Did you? David answered, I didn't expect her to act. Grace nodded. That was the flaw. Rebecca turned to Grace. So what now? Grace answered, now everything gets examined. Rebecca's chest tightened, including me. Grace didn't soften it, especially you. David laughed bitterly. She's sacrificing her own daughter. Grace replied, I'm refusing to sacrifice myself again. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. You always disappear when things get hard. Grace corrected her. I stay quiet, there's a difference. David's phone rang again. He answered reluctantly. Yes, I understand. No, I'm at the venue. Pause. His voice lowered. I'll handle it. He ended the call and looked at Grace with resentment. They're distancing, he said. My name is becoming inconvenient. Grace replied, that happens when truth arrives. Rebecca whispered, you knew this would cost him. Grace nodded, I knew it would reveal him. Rebecca looked between them. Was any of this real? David answered quickly, of course it was. Grace watched Rebecca. You're allowed to decide that. Rebecca took a step back from David. Not dramatic, just deliberate. David noticed. Don't. Rebecca said quietly, you never asked what I wanted. You told me what I should want. David snapped, that's how success works. Grace said, that's how dependence works. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. She didn't check it. What if I lose everything? Rebecca asked. Grace answered, then you rebuild with clarity. David laughed, she'll destroy you. Grace replied, I built her once. Rebecca looked at Grace. You planned for this moment. Grace answered, I prepared for it. Rebecca swallowed, I don't know who to trust. Grace said, then start with who never demanded payment for love. David stepped back. For the first time, he had nothing left to offer. And he knew it. David's phone rang again. This time, he answered without speaking. He listened. His face changed. Yes, he said finally, I understand. He ended the call and looked at Grace. They're asking for signatures. Grace replied, they already have what they need. Rebecca felt the shift immediately. What signatures? David didn't look at her. Damage control. Grace spoke evenly. Disclosure statements, liability acknowledgements, separation of interests. Rebecca's voice tightened. Separation from what? Grace answered, from you. David turned sharply. You don't get to decide that. Grace replied, ownership does. Rebecca stared at her mother. You're removing him. Grace nodded, from anything tied to me. David laughed once hollow. You think that protects her? Grace said, it stops him. Rebecca stepped back. You said you loved me. David snapped, I still do. Grace said, love doesn't invoice. Rebecca flinched. David looked at Grace with open hostility. You waited until we were exposed. Grace answered, you exposed yourselves. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. She opened the message and read silently. Her hands shook. They're reopening past records, she said. All of them. Grace nodded. That's how audits work. Rebecca whispered, I signed those transfers. Grace replied, under influence. David stepped forward. Don't rewrite history. Grace met his eyes. The records already did. Rebecca looked at David. Why didn't you tell me about the risk? David answered, you wouldn't have understood. That sentence ended everything. Rebecca straightened. You underestimated me. David scoffed. You needed guidance. Grace said quietly, you needed access. Rebecca's phone rang. She answered. Yes, I see. No, I'm here. Pause. Her voice dropped. Understood. She ended the call and looked at Grace. They're suspending my authority. Grace nodded, temporarily. Rebecca exhaled slowly. And yours? Grace replied, they can't. David's jaw tightened. This is a hostile takeover. Grace corrected him. This is enforcement. Rebecca looked around. Guests were leaving. Conversations had turned cold. The wedding had become an incident. Rebecca turned to Grace. If I ask you to stop. Grace interrupted gently. I can't. Rebecca swallowed. Then what happens to me? Grace answered honestly. You decide who you are without protection. David stepped back. You're choosing her over me. Grace replied, I chose myself. Rebecca closed her eyes. When she opened them, she wasn't looking at David anymore. Rebecca spoke first. I need space. David laughed softly. From who? Rebecca answered, from you. David's smile didn't move. You're reacting. Grace remained silent. Rebecca continued, every decision lately came with pressure. Every risk was minimized for you, not for me. David's voice sharpened. I built momentum. Grace said, you borrowed it. David turned to Grace. You want her isolated. Grace replied, I want her uncoerced. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. She didn't check it. She had already decided something. I'm stepping away, Rebecca said. David stared at her. From what? Rebecca answered, from your plans. David shook his head. You'll regret this. Grace finally spoke. Threats arrive when leverage leaves. David stepped closer to Rebecca. You think she'll save you? Rebecca looked at Grace. I don't expect saving. Grace nodded once. David's phone rang again. He ignored it. Grace said, that call matters. David snapped, everything matters now. Rebecca asked quietly, did you ever intend to keep her in our lives? David didn't answer. That was enough. Rebecca turned away from him. Grace felt the moment settle, not victory, finality. A man from the legal team approached Grace again. Confirmation needed. Grace nodded. Proceed with phase 2. Rebecca's breath caught. Phase 2. Grace answered, disclosure. David froze. You promised confidentiality. Grace replied, I promised accuracy. Rebecca whispered, what does that mean? Grace said, it means everyone learns what they're connected to. David stepped back. You can't do this. Grace met his eyes. I already did. Rebecca's phone buzzed. She finally checked it. Her face changed. They're notifying partners. Grace nodded. David laughed bitterly. You're burning bridges. Grace said, I'm closing exits you plan to use alone. Rebecca looked at David. You said this wedding was the start. David replied, it was. Grace added, for consequences. Rebecca took a breath. I'm done. David stared at her. You'll come back. Rebecca said, not to this. Grace watched him carefully. The confidence was gone. Only calculation remained. David looked at Grace. You raised her to be this. Grace replied, I raised her to choose. David turned away. For the first time, he had nowhere useful to go. And everyone knew it. The announcement didn't come over a microphone. It didn't need to. Phones buzzed across the room in uneven waves. One message, then another. Guests stopped pretending not to watch. Conversations ended mid-sentence. David checked his phone once. Then he didn't check it again. Rebecca watched faces change around her. Familiar smiles turned guarded. People who had congratulated her minutes earlier now avoided eye contact. She looked at Grace. They know. Grace nodded. They were going to know eventually. David muttered, you could have waited. Grace replied, you didn't. A man from David's family approached. He didn't greet Rebecca. David, he said, your father wants you, now. David hesitated, then followed. Rebecca didn't go after him. She stayed where she was, standing beside the woman she had almost erased. Is this what you wanted? Rebecca asked. Grace answered, this is what was required. Rebecca swallowed. People are judging me. Grace said, they always were, you just didn't feel it yet. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. She read quickly. They're suspending contracts, she said, pending review. Grace replied, that's standard. Rebecca looked up sharply. Nothing about tonight feels standard. Grace said, that's because tonight removes illusions. Across the room, David raised his voice. Not loud enough to draw attention, loud enough to reveal stress. No, you don't understand, he said. This wasn't supposed to happen. Grace watched without expression. Rebecca whispered, he never sounds like that. Grace replied, pressure changes tone. A woman approached Rebecca cautiously. I'm so sorry, we weren't told. Rebecca nodded. She didn't ask what they weren't told. The woman glanced at Grace, then walked away. Rebecca exhaled slowly. I thought power was loud. Grace said, it's quiet when it works. David returned, his expression had shifted again, controlled, cold. This ends now, he said to Grace. Grace met his eyes. It already did. David turned to Rebecca. Come with me. Rebecca didn't move. Grace said nothing. David's jaw tightened. This is your mother's doing. Rebecca answered calmly. This is your planning. David's phone buzzed again. He silenced it. They're calling an emergency meeting, he said. Without us. Grace replied, that happens when risk becomes visible. Rebecca looked around. This wedding is over. David scoffed, it's not. Grace said, it is. Music stopped, staff waited, guests began leaving without goodbyes. Rebecca stood still. For the first time that night, she wasn't reacting. She was deciding. And David could feel it slipping. David lowered his voice. We can still fix this. Rebecca didn't answer. He turned to Grace. Name your price. Grace replied, you already did. David's expression hardened. Money, control, silence, pick one. Grace said, you misunderstand what you lost. Rebecca finally spoke. You said this wedding secured my future. David replied quickly, it still can. Grace asked, with what foundation? David ignored her. Rebecca, come with me, we'll make a statement, calm investors, shift blame. Rebecca looked at him, blame who? David hesitated. Grace said, that pause is everything. David snapped, you poisoned her against me. Grace replied, you revealed yourself. Rebecca's phone buzzed again, she checked it. They want a statement, she said, now. Grace asked, from who? Rebecca answered, from me. David smiled faintly. Good, say we're aligned. Grace said nothing. Rebecca looked at her mother. If I do that, does this stop? Grace answered, it delays. Rebecca turned back to David. You knew this would explode. David said, I expected her to fold. Grace nodded, that's why this happened. David stepped closer to Grace. You're not untouchable. Grace replied, I don't need to be. Rebecca inhaled, I'm done being negotiated. David's eyes widened, you're choosing her. Rebecca answered, I'm choosing myself. Grace watched David carefully. This was the moment he would either retreat or strike. He smiled. Fine, he said, then let's be honest. Rebecca stiffened. About what? David looked at Grace. About where the money came from. Grace met his gaze. Go on. David turned to Rebecca. Ask her how much of your business she really owns. Grace said enough. David pressed. Ask her why she never told you. Grace replied, I did, you didn't listen. Rebecca looked between them. Is there more? Grace answered, there's always more. David leaned back. She built protection for herself, not you. Grace said calmly, I built protection for both of us. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. She didn't look. David took a breath. Last chance. Grace replied, that passed when you demanded payment for love. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she said, I'll issue the statement. David relaxed slightly. Rebecca continued, but not the one you want. David froze. Grace didn't move. Rebecca turned away from him and began typing. David reached out. Rebecca. She pulled her arm back. Grace watched as the final offer collapsed without resistance. Because it had never been enough, Rebecca finished typing. She didn't reread it. She pressed send. David realized too late that she hadn't asked for approval. What did you say? He asked. Rebecca replied, the truth. Grace remained silent. David pulled out his phone. Notifications flooded in. Messages from partners, from family, from people who had stopped answering earlier. His jaw tightened. You just separated yourself from me. Rebecca answered, I separated myself from lies. David turned to Grace. You coached this. Grace replied, I didn't write it. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. She read quickly. They acknowledged it, she said. They're proceeding independently. David stared at her. You've made yourself vulnerable. Grace said, she made herself credible. David laughed once. Credibility doesn't pay when doors close. Grace answered, "It opens different ones." Rebecca looked at David. "You said this was partnership." David snapped, "It was strategy." Grace said, "That's why it failed." David stepped back, "You think this ends clean?" Grace replied, "Nothing ends clean, it ends correctly." Rebecca's phone rang. She answered. "Yes, I understand. No, I won't contest." She ended the call and looked at Grace. "They want to meet you." Grace nodded. "They will." David clenched his fists. "You're replacing me." Grace said, "You replaced yourself." Rebecca took a breath. "This wedding," David cut in, "is still happening." Grace said, "It isn't." David turned sharply. "You don't decide that." Rebecca replied, "I do." David stared at her. "After everything I did for you." Rebecca answered, "After everything you hid." Silence followed. Then David's phone rang again. He didn't answer. Grace spoke calmly, "It's time." David looked at her. "For what?" Grace replied, "For consequences to finish arriving." Rebecca stepped away from him. David watched her go. For the first time, he understood what he had lost. Not money. Not leverage. Time. And it wasn't coming back. David stood still while the room shifted away from him. Phones kept lighting up. Conversations ended as soon as he approached. People who once waited for his approval now waited for distance. Rebecca walked toward Grace. They scheduled the meeting for tomorrow morning. Grace replied, "Good." David turned sharply. "You planned this timing." Grace answered, "I planned readiness." Rebecca checked her phone again. Her expression tightened. "They're suspending shared accounts." Grace nodded. "That follows." David stepped between them. "This damages everyone." Grace replied, "Damage already existed." Rebecca looked at him. "You said risk was controlled." David answered, "It was." Grace corrected him, "It was hidden." A man from the venue approached. "We need authorization to continue." Rebecca hesitated. Grace spoke, "End it." The man nodded and left. David stared, "You're canceling the wedding." Grace replied, "The event lost purpose." Rebecca exhaled slowly. She felt relief before she understood it. David's phone rang again. He answered with restraint. "Yes, understood, I hear you." Pause. "I'll comply." He ended the call and looked at Grace. "They're separating liabilities." Grace nodded, "Expected." Rebecca asked quietly, "What happens to him?" Grace replied, "Accountability chooses direction." David laughed bitterly. "You think this makes you strong?" Grace answered, "Strength stopped mattering." Rebecca looked at Grace. "What matters now?" Grace replied, "Clarity." David stepped back. "You're both underestimating fallout." Grace said, "Fallout follows deception." Rebecca checked another message. Her hand steadied. "They want records, full access." Grace nodded, "Granted." David shook his head. "You're handing them everything." Grace replied, "Transparency ends speculation." David turned away. "I built this with intent." Grace said, "Intent without consent collapses." Rebecca watched him carefully. "You never asked." David stopped walking. Grace spoke evenly. "That silence built this moment." Rebecca felt the shift complete. The wedding had ended earlier than announced. The consequences had arrived earlier than planned. David stood alone, surrounded by exits that no longer opened. Grace turned toward Rebecca. "We leave." Rebecca followed. David didn't stop them. He already understood. The unraveling had finished. Grace and Rebecca walked without speaking. Behind them, the room kept moving, but it no longer followed them. That was the shift. Attention had moved on. Power had relocated. Rebecca broke the silence first. "They're asking where you are." Grace replied, "They'll find me." Rebecca checked her phone. "David is calling." Grace said, "You don't need to answer." Rebecca didn't. She muted the call. Another message appeared, then another. "They're asking about the transfers," Rebecca said. "Dates, reasons." Grace nodded. "Answer only what you know." Rebecca looked up. "You've been doing this longer than I realized." Grace replied, "I learned early." Rebecca hesitated. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Grace answered, "You needed to believe you didn't need me." Rebecca swallowed, "I believed the wrong people." Grace said, "That happens when certainty is borrowed." Rebecca's phone buzzed again. She read quickly. "They want to pause everything," she said, "publicly." Grace replied, "That creates space." Rebecca exhaled, "I feel exposed." Grace said, "Exposure ends manipulation." They stopped. Rebecca turned to Grace, "He's going to fight this." Grace answered, "He already is." Rebecca asked, "What if he wins?" Grace replied, "He won't." Rebecca searched her face, "How do you know?" Grace said, "Because he built his position on silence." Rebecca nodded slowly. Her phone rang again. She answered this time. "Yes, I understand, tomorrow morning." She ended the call. "They want you there," she said, "in person." Grace replied, "I'll attend." Rebecca looked uneasy. "They won't be gentle." Grace said, "They don't need to be." Rebecca checked one last message, her voice lowered. David's family released a statement. Grace asked, "About?" Rebecca read, "They're distancing themselves, citing misrepresentation." Grace nodded, "That closes his exits." Rebecca looked back toward the venue. "He's alone now." Grace replied, "That's not my concern." Rebecca hesitated, "It used to be." Grace said, "I know." Another call came through. Rebecca declined it. She looked at Grace, "What happens to us?" Grace answered clearly, "We move forward separately if needed, together if chosen." Rebecca nodded, "I choose clarity." Grace met her eyes, "Then you'll be fine." Behind them, David stood where they had left him. For the first time, there was no one left to negotiate with. And the silence answered everything. David didn't follow them. He stayed where he was, and answered the call he had avoided too long. "Yes," he said. Pause. "I understand." Another pause. His voice lowered. "I didn't misrepresent anything." Silence answered him. "I'll cooperate," he added. The call ended. David looked around. No one was waiting for him. Across the property, Rebecca checked her phone again. "They're asking for timelines." Grace replied, "Give them dates, nothing else." Rebecca nodded, "They want mine first." Grace said, "That matters." Rebecca hesitated, "They'll ask about you." Grace replied, "Tell them I'm available." Rebecca looked relieved, "You're not angry." Grace answered, "Anger wastes focus." Rebecca's phone rang. She answered. "Yes, tomorrow morning, understood." She ended the call. "They want a preliminary statement tonight." Grace said, "Draft it, keep it factual." Rebecca asked, "What if they pressure me?" Grace replied, "Pressure reveals intention." Rebecca nodded. "They're already separating public narrative from legal review." Grace said, "That protects them." Rebecca asked, "Does it protect us?" Grace answered, "It protects accuracy." Rebecca glanced back once more. "He's still calling." Grace replied, "He will." Rebecca muted the phone. "What if he comes after you?" Grace said, "He already tried." Rebecca exhaled slowly. "I didn't see it." Grace replied, "You weren't supposed to." Rebecca's phone buzzed again, a message this time. She read it and stiffened. "They're freezing personal assets connected to shared accounts." Grace nodded, "That isolates him." Rebecca swallowed, "He'll say I betrayed him." Grace replied, "He'll say whatever preserves him." Rebecca looked at Grace. "Did you ever think it would reach this point?" Grace answered, "I prepared for it." Rebecca lowered her voice. "What if I hadn't chosen this?" Grace said, "Then I would have chosen distance." Rebecca absorbed that. "You would have walked away." Grace replied, "Yes." Rebecca nodded once. "I'm glad I didn't force you to." Another call came in, different number. Rebecca answered. "Yes, I'm with her." Pause. "She'll be there." She ended the call and looked at Grace. "They want both of us present." Grace replied, "Then we go together." Rebecca felt steadier hearing it. Behind them, David's phone lit up again. This time, it wasn't someone asking questions. It was someone ending answers. And he could feel it. Tomorrow would decide what survived. Tonight had already decided what didn't. David found them before they reached the exit. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He adjusted his tone the way he always did when leverage slipped. "Rebecca," he said, "we need to talk." Grace stopped. Rebecca didn't. "This is between us," David added, looking at Grace. Grace replied, "Everything you did made it mine." David ignored her. "You made a statement without me." Rebecca answered, "I made it without lies." David stepped closer. "You're handing them ammunition." Grace said, "You already loaded it." David's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what's coming." Grace replied, "I mapped it." Rebecca turned to him. "Why didn't you tell me about the accounts?" David hesitated. "I didn't want to complicate things." Grace said, "You wanted to control timing." David snapped, "This isn't over." Grace replied, "It ended when you demanded payment." Rebecca felt the weight of that sentence settle. David tried again, "We can issue a joint correction." Grace answered, "Corrections follow falsehoods." David looked at Rebecca, "You're choosing her." Rebecca said calmly, "I'm choosing truth." David laughed quietly, "Truth won't protect you." Grace replied, "It already did." David's phone rang. He answered reluctantly. "Yes, I hear you." Pause. "No, I didn't inform her." Another pause. "I understand." He ended the call and looked at Grace with open hostility. "They're escalating," he said. Grace nodded, "So are consequences." Rebecca's phone buzzed. She checked it and went still. "They're removing him from interim authority," she said. David stiffened. "They can't." Grace replied, "They did." David took a step back. The confidence finally broke. "You planned this from the beginning," he said. Grace answered, "I planned for survival." Rebecca looked at David. "You planned for extraction." David shook his head. "You owe me." Grace replied, "No one owes manipulation." Rebecca took a breath. "I'm done." David's voice dropped. "You'll regret this." Grace answered, "Regret follows silence." Rebecca turned away from him. David didn't follow. He knew the line had been crossed. And it wasn't his anymore. They didn't look back. Rebecca's phone kept vibrating, but she didn't answer. The messages stacked. Requests, warnings, questions framed as concern. Grace said nothing. She let the silence do its work. Rebecca finally spoke. "They're closing ranks." Grace replied, "They always do." Rebecca checked one message and stopped. "They're issuing notices tonight." Grace nodded. "That shortens the window." Rebecca asked, "For what?" Grace answered, "For denial." Rebecca felt it then, the weight lifting, the fear thinning. David's voice echoed behind them, not loud, controlled. "Rebecca." She didn't turn. Grace said, "Keep moving." David tried again. "This ends badly." Grace replied without turning, "It already ended." Rebecca's phone buzzed with a new sender. She read it once. "They're removing his access," she said. Grace nodded. "That seals it." Rebecca swallowed. "He'll blame me." Grace said, "He already does." They reached the edge of the property. Rebecca stopped. "I need to say one thing." Grace looked at her. "Say it." Rebecca turned back toward David. "You asked me to trade my mother for comfort," she said. "You asked her to trade dignity for access." David didn't respond. Rebecca continued, "That tells me everything." David's face hardened. "You're making a mistake." Grace stepped forward. "You already made yours." David looked at Grace. "You'll regret burning bridges." Grace replied, "Bridges built on leverage collapse on their own." David said nothing. Rebecca turned away again. They walked on. Behind them, David stood still, surrounded by unanswered calls and obligations that no longer protected him. Rebecca felt her phone vibrate again. She silenced it. "They want a meeting first thing," she said. Grace replied, "We'll be there." Rebecca hesitated. "Are you sure?" Grace said, "Certainty isn't required." Rebecca nodded. Another message arrived. Rebecca glanced at it. "They're canceling remaining events." Grace said, "Good." Rebecca breathed out slowly. "I thought power meant never being questioned." Grace replied, "Power survives questioning." They stopped at the edge of the path. Rebecca looked at Grace. "I almost lost you." Grace answered, "You nearly chose distance." Rebecca said, "I won't again." Grace didn't respond, she didn't need to. Behind them, the wedding dissolved into logistics and liability. Ahead of them, the future waited without guarantees. And that was enough. Morning arrived without ceremony. Rebecca and Grace entered the meeting together. Questions came fast. Dates, approvals, transfers, decisions. Rebecca answered what she knew. Grace answered what she documented. Nothing overlapped, nothing contradicted. That mattered. By the end, silence returned. One of them spoke, "We'll proceed without him." Grace nodded, Rebecca didn't react. Another added, "Public narrative will separate personal choices from operational failure." Grace replied, "Accuracy matters more than narrative." They agreed. Outside, Rebecca checked her phone. The final message arrived. David's access terminated, authority revoked, association under review. Rebecca closed the screen. "It's done," she said. Grace answered, "It's complete." Rebecca hesitated, "I don't feel relief." Grace replied, "You feel clarity." They walked away. Later that day, the statement circulated. Clean language, precise distance. No blame, no defense. The wedding became a footnote. The collapse became procedural. David attempted contact once more. Rebecca didn't respond. Grace didn't block him. She didn't need to. Weeks passed. The business resumed under review. Slower, smaller, honest. Rebecca worked without spectacle. Decisions required explanation now, she learned quickly. Grace stayed present but silent. Ownership didn't need to announce itself. One evening, Rebecca asked, "When did you know this would happen?" Grace answered, "When you stopped seeing me." Rebecca nodded, "I won't do that again." Grace replied, "You don't need to promise." Another message arrived that night. David had settled, quietly, fully. He didn't contest, he couldn't. Rebecca read it once, then deleted it. "What do we call this?" she asked. Grace said, "An ending." Rebecca thought for a moment, "And a beginning." Grace replied, "Only if you choose it." Rebecca looked up, "I choose it." Grace nodded. Nothing dramatic followed. No apology, no reunion, no forgiveness demanded. Just consequences that held. The demand for $50,000 was never mentioned again. Neither was the ultimatum. Because the only thing that mattered was this. They asked for payment. She answered with truth. And everything else rearranged itself around that. You have reached the end of the text.